Bishop Demetrius, if you recall him, he had been a bishop at the time of Origen. And I like to draw a little parallel. In Alexandria, Egypt, Bishop Demetrius exerted his authority over Origen, the ascetic scholar. Origen, as you recall, never wore shoes, never slept in a bed. He denied himself physical pleasure. He was an ascetic, and he was an incredibly intelligent man. He was a scholar. Eventually, he got ordained as a presbyter, but he had to go outside of his area to do that. And when Demetrius found out about it, he got furious. And eventually, Origen just left. He just moved out of the city. And Demetrius lost like the number one Christian celebrity in his city because they couldn't agree. So it was that was in the 3rd century. So it was in the 4th century that Bishop Alexander was the authoritarian bishop seeking to control Christians in the city. Not all necessarily badly motivated, but that's the way they conceived of their role at that time. And he was against Arius, who was an ascetic scholar, also ordained as a presbyter in Alexandria, Egypt. And the two of them had a serious falling out, and Alexander ended up excommunicating Arius from the church. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What are we talking about? We're talking about the beginning of a controversy that lasted from the year 318 all the way up to the year 381. And today we're just covering the beginning. We're just going to kind of dip our toes in 325 but not jump in, okay? And we'll come back to that in our next session. Alexander of Alexandria was bishop from 313 to 326 of Alexandria, Egypt. He engaged in several controversies. He argued with a man named Arius about when to celebrate Easter. He had a controversy with a bishop named Meletius of Lycopolis, and he would not admit him to communion, or Meletius wouldn't admit to communion those who had denied Christ in the persecution, and Alexander thought he should. Eventually, they established peace with each other. And then Alexander also had controversies. The biggest things that he's known for is his controversies with Arius. So let's take a look at Arius. Arius was born around 260, give or take, and lived until 336. When the controversy occurred, he was about 62 years old, an older man. He was at the Council of Nicaea. He was already 70 years old. He's from Libya in Africa. He was ordained as an elder in one of the oldest and most prestigious churches in all of Alexandria. He was, according to one historian, a guy named Sozomen, he was a zealous thinker about doctrine. And Sozomen also says that even Alexander held Arius in high repute, since he was a most expert logician. So everyone recognizes that Arius is really smart. He's an ascetic. He has a good reputation. He's a conservative. He's not some random outsider who came up with a new idea. He is part of the church order. He's in his 60s. He's not a young man. And Alvin Lamson likes to make the point that in all the controversies with Arius, nobody ever accuses him of immorality, of unethical behavior. They attack his ideas, they call him insane, but they don't ever say he cheated on his wife or I don't know that he had a wife, probably not if he's an ascetic, but they don't accuse him of moral failings. So the initial controversy broke out in Alexandria in the year 318 at a conference, a pastor's conference, a clergy meeting that Alexander had, and a historian named Socrates Scholasticus, not the philosopher, but someone who lived centuries and centuries after Socrates, a philosopher, he wrote the following. He, Alexander, in the fearless exercise of his functions for the instruction and government of the church, attempted one day, in the presence of the presbytery and the rest of his clergy, to explain with, this is the best part, perhaps too philosophical minuteness, the great theological mystery, the unity of the Holy Trinity. Now, I do want to point out that Socrates is writing in 380, and he lived from 380 to 439, so he's writing in the 5th century. So by the 5th century, there's an established doctrine of the Trinity, and so he's kind of retrojecting that back into the initial controversy. More likely what was the issue is that Alexander, the bishop, has all his clergy there, and he's explaining how the Father and the Son are one. How are they unified between Father and Son? The Holy Spirit wasn't really much of a conversation point until later. But Arius didn't like it. A certain one of the presbyters, Socrates goes on, under his jurisdiction, whose... hold on one second. There we go. Whose name was Arius, possessed of no inconsiderable logical acumen. That's a really big compliment from a hostile witness. Imagining that the bishop was subtly teaching the same view of this subject as Sabellius, the Libyan, took the opposite opinion to that of the Libyan, and as he thought, vigorously responded to what was said by the bishop. If, said he, the Father begat the Son, he that was begotten had a beginning of existence, and from this it is evident that there was a time when the Son was not. It therefore necessarily follows that he had his substance from nothing. And once again, this is a historian, but he's writing a century after the events have occurred. But he's giving us, the best insight we can get as far as what happened at this particular event. And, well, there might be other letters and so on that we could look at. But he gives us a window into what was happening. And I do appreciate how seemingly unbiased he is in his description of this. He makes clear that it was Alexander that was speculating, that was perhaps with too philosophical minuteness describing something that was really beyond his level of description. And here's Arius, a super smart guy, that's just like, what do you mean the Son's eternal? They're not brothers, they're father and son. If he's begotten, he has a beginning. He's very keen logically, and he starts to disagree. And he starts to teach, and this is a key phrase here, that there was a time when the Son was not. So there was a beginning to the Son of God. Alexander, the bishop, says the Son is eternal. Arius says that's impossible, he's begotten. The only eternal one is the Father. So that you understand the controversy. Word came back to Alexander that Arius had disagreed and was teaching this in his church, and we get a debate. I think this is interesting too. So this is another historian named Sozomen, also from the 5th century. He writes, those who heard these doctrines advanced blamed Alexander for not opposing the innovations at variance with doctrine, but this bishop deemed it more advisable to leave each party to the free discussion of doubtful topics, so that by persuasion, rather than by force, they might cease from contention. Hence, he sat down as a judge with some of his clergy and led both sides into a discussion. But it happened on this occasion, as is generally the case in a strife of words, that each party claimed the victory. How many debates have you heard about where both sides say they won? Arius defended his assertions, but the others contended that the Son is consubstantial and co-eternal with the Father. The council was convened a second time, so we had a second debate. And the same points contested, but they came to no agreement amongst themselves. During the debate, Alexander seemed to incline first to one party and then to the others. Finally, however, he declared himself in favor of those who affirmed that the Son was consubstantial and co-eternal with the Father. And he commanded Arius to receive this doctrine and to reject the former opinions. Arius, however, would not be persuaded to compliance, and many of the bishops and clergy considered his statement of doctrine to be correct. This is another astounding statement where it says, many of the bishops and clergy considered his statement, Arius' statement of doctrine, to be correct. Most textbooks are going to call this whole controversy, this whole issue that erupts in 318 and continues on for another 60 years, they were going to call it the Arian controversy. This is to retroject later labels and really propaganda into the way we talk about this event. This is not Arius coming up with a new doctrine. Does he come up with new ideas? Yes, he does. But he's responding to Alexander, who he perceives is coming up with a new way of talking about Father and Son that is unacceptable. So it's more properly called, and the textbook that I use is the one by Joseph Lynch. He makes this point. It's more properly called the Trinitarian controversy. It's not the Arian controversy. It's the Trinitarian. Arius was not a very significant person in the controversy if you look at the whole period of time. He's just the guy that had the initial confrontation and got kicked out. Okay? People who argue Arius' position 30, 40, 50 years later, they don't even know who Arius is. So you can't call it the Arian controversy. So what happened after the debates? Well, Alexander decided, no, we're going to stick with the Son as being co-eternal. And so he had a council of bishops to get together, had Arius attend, presented Arius with a confession of faith, told him to sign it. Arius said no. Alexander said, you're excommunicated. To be excommunicated means you're not allowed to attend any church in the entire region of Alexandria, not just the city, but the entire region of northeast Africa. He has a reach, Alexander and the Alexandrian bishops, that goes all the way down to Libya and to other regions around that area of Alexandria. When Arius got kicked out, 89 others left with him, including clergy, presbyters, and 7 presbyters and 12 deacons. Then, after Alexander kicks out Arius, he says, I have to write a letter to all the different churches, to all the clergy. So he does that, and he explains why he excommunicated Arius. And this is what's called an encyclical, a letter that is circulated throughout the churches, sent out by a bishop or someone in authority. Arius wrote letters to influential bishops because from his local situation, there's no recourse. Alexander is the top guy. In fact, at this time, he was already called the Pope. Not of Rome, the Pope of Alexandria. They're already using this terminology in the early 4th century for Alexandria, for Alexander. So Arius has no recourse. The only thing he can do is move. But he's in his 60s. He doesn't want to move. So he writes to other bishops of sufficient standing, like Alexander, and he asks them, can you talk to my bishop? He kicked me out of the church. And he, basically lays out his case. And he gets a hearing from Eusebius of Caesarea, the church historian, and another Eusebius of Nicomedia. Nicomedia was a very significant city at this time. It had been basically the Roman Empire's capital before Constantinople was Nicomedia. Functionally a capital. Rome was still the official capital. And this is then when they say to Arius, you need to write a nice letter to your bishop. Explain yourself. So we have this letter of Arius written to Alexander explaining himself. Firsthand, eyewitness testimony of what was going on at that time. And this is what Arius says. To our blessed Pope and Bishop Alexander, the presbyters and deacons send health in the Lord. Our faith from our forefathers, which also we have learned from thee, blessed Pope, is this. We acknowledge one God, alone, ingenerate, alone, everlasting, alone, unbegun, alone, true, alone, having immortality, alone, wise, alone, good, alone, sovereign, judge, governor, and providence of all, unalterable and unchangeable, just and good, God of law and prophets and New Testament, who begat an only begotten Son before eternal times. This is really the key word, this word begat here. the only begotten Son before eternal times, through whom he has made both the ages and the universe, and begat him, not in semblance, but in truth, that he made him subsist at his own will, unalterable and unchangeable, perfect creature of God. This is another buzzword, calling Jesus a creature rather than eternal, but not as one of the creatures. He's not like every other created thing. Offspring, but not as one of the things begotten, nor as Valentinus pronounced that the offspring of the Father was an issue, nor as Manichaeus taught that the offspring was a portion of the Father, one in essence, or as Sibelius, dividing the monad, speaks of Son and Father, nor as Hyrcanus of one torch from another. What has Arius just done? He listed off a bunch of heretics. Heretics are Christians you disagree with, just for the record. Valentinus, he taught that the offspring of the Father was an issue. Or Manichaeus, there's another heretic. He taught this other doctrine about the offspring and this phrase, one in essence. He's like, that's a heresy. We don't believe one in essence. One in essence becomes the buzzword and the center of orthodoxy after this whole thing. But at the time of Arius writing this letter, he could confidently hand-wave this idea of one of substance or one of essence as a heretical, dismissed, illegal expression that you wouldn't use to describe the Father and the Son. And then he also mentions Sibelius, and that's really the one that he's worried about. He thought, according to Socrates, the historian, Arius thought that Alexander sounded like Sibelius. Sibelius taught the Father was the Son. There was no distinction between them. It's the idea of modalism, that there are different modes or aspects to the one God, not different persons. The language, incidentally, of personhood, which is used typically to talk about the Trinity today, didn't yet exist. They just didn't have it. So nobody does three who's and one what. Like, that's not a move you can make. Nobody talks about person as distinct from being. It's just not around yet. Okay, that's later terminology that'll be invented. But at this time, one in essence is actually a heretical teaching, and it's something that is associated with, in particular, Sibelius, who believes the Father is of the same substance as the Son because they are really the same being. And so then he goes on. He talks about Hyrcanus, another heretic. So Arius sees himself as an insider who's trying to help his bishop that he knows he's smarter than to not fall into heresy. And the bishop is just kind of got like one move, which is, you're out of here. And he just keeps doing it to Arius. And Arius is trying to gently bring him along, and it's not working. So he goes on, nor that he was before, was afterward generated or new created into a son, as thou too, blessed Pope, in the midst of the church and in session hast often condemned. He's like, look, man, you used to condemn all these heresies. I'm condemning these heresies. I'm part of your church, man. But as we say, at the will of God, created before times and before ages, and gaining life and being from the Father, who gave subsistence to his glories together with him. For the Father did not, in giving to him the inheritance of all things, deprive himself of what he has ingenerately in himself, for he is the fountain of all things. Thus there are three subsistences, and God, being the cause of all things, is unbegun. That's another big word for Arius. The Father is unbegun, and altogether sole, but the Son being begotten, apart from time, by the Father, and being created and founded before ages, was not before his generation. There it is again, the idea that he was not, he did not exist before his generation. But being begotten apart from time, before all things, alone, was made to subsist by the Father, for he is not eternal, or co-eternal, or co-unoriginate with the Father, nor has he his being together with the Father, as some speak of relations, introducing two ingenerate beginnings. But God is before all things, as being monad and beginning of all. Wherefore also he is before the Son, as we have learned also from thy preaching in the midst of the church. So far then as from God he has being and glories and life, and all things are delivered unto him. In such sense is God his origin. For he is above him, as being his God and before him. Whew, that was kind of a long reading. You'll be interested to know that Arius was allegedly, according to his enemies, a public relations genius. A guy who kind of like just wrote against a lot of Christians who lived before him, a man named Photius, quoted another one named Philostorgius as saying, so this is like hearsay of hearsay centuries later, but what they said is that Arius put down his beliefs to rhyme and meter and turn them into songs that were sung by sailors and millers and travelers on the road. So although what I just read to you may have seemed a tad dry and repetitive, I assure you that Arius was able to get his message out and sound the alarm. Alexander, in response to this, did not accept him back into the church. He wrote more letters, and he wrote to other bishops, and he said, don't take this Arius. He's bad news. His ideas are wrong. Let me prove to you that the Son is eternal. He doubles down. He gets his verses together, and he continues to argue his case. Here is a sample of Alexander of Alexandria, who wrote a letter to Alexander of Constantinople. I guess they were short on names, huh? To the most reverend and like-minded brother Alexander sends greeting in the Lord. The ambitious and avaricious will of wicked men is always wont to lay snares against those churches which seem greater, by various pretexts attacking the ecclesiastical piety of such. These guys were smart people, right? I mean, it's incredible how they write. For incited by the devil, who works in them, he's talking about Arius, to the lust of that which is set before them, and throwing away all religious scruples, they trample underfoot the fear of the judgment of God. Concerning which things I, who suffer, have thought it necessary to show to your piety, in order that you may be aware of such men, lest any of them presume to set foot in your diocese, whether by themselves or by others. For these sorcerers know how to use hypocrisy to carry out their fraud. Then he goes on, building for themselves dens of thieves, they hold their assemblies in them unceasingly, night and day, directing their calumnies against Christ and against us. For since they call in question all pious and apostolical doctrine, after the manner of the Jews, they have constructed a workshop for contending against Christ, denying the Godhead of our Savior and preaching that he is only the equal of all others. And now, indeed, they drag us before the tribunals of the judges by intercourse with silly and disorderly women, whom they have led into error. At another time, they cast opprobrium and infamy upon the Christian religion, their young maidens disgracefully wandering about every village and street. Nay, even Christ's indivisible tunic, which his executioners were unwilling to divide, these wretches have dared to rend. For those inventors of stupid fables say that we who turn away with aversion from the impious and unscriptural blasphemy against Christ of those who speak of his coming from the things which are not, assert that there are two unbegottens. So he wrote this letter and many other letters like it to defend his eternal Son position. Now, I want to be careful here. A lot of what comes up in the debate are quotations and writings of Origen of Alexandria. Of course, Origen of Alexandria was influenced by Clement of Alexandria, who was influenced by Philo of Alexandria. You can kind of see the march from Logos and Philo, which is called a begotten of God. But the Logos of Philo is not Jesus. It's nothing to do with, he's not a Christian. Philo's a Jew. So it's just a philosophical idea. It's like sort of like God's hand through which he's able to create the universe. And Philo believes the Logos is eternal. Right? And in Origen, it's clear that he also believed the Logos was eternal. And there were other Christians that believed that God had an internal Logos that he then externalized and it became an independent being. So there's not a lot of clarity on this, but with Origen, we have both. The idea that the Son is eternal. He even makes a big point of saying, how could he ever not be the Father? That's one of Origen's biggest arguments. To say that the Son was begotten or came into existence implies that the Father had to change. And we know that God cannot change. That's one of his beliefs. That's from Platonism. That's not from the Bible. In the Bible, God changes all the time. And God has emotions in the Bible too, not in Plato. But Origen is going to say he's eternal and he's eternally begotten. Alexander is picking up on the eternal side of it, and Arius is picking up on the begotten side of it, and they both are followers of Origen and his teachings. It's really fascinating how this all played out. So then we had some councils. We had the council in Bithynia in 321, and that was called by Eusebius of Nicomedia. Eusebius of Nicomedia is a very influential, important person. In the end, Constantine has him baptize him on his deathbed. Eusebius of Nicomedia. He's not a second-rate guy. And he's fully backing Arius. He also believes the same as Arius that the Son has a beginning. And so the first council that's called outside of Alexandria is in Bithynia, and it's called by Eusebius of Nicomedia, and it agrees that Arius is orthodox, or Arius has the correct doctrine. The second council is held in Alexandria by Alexander, and it confirms that Alexander's right. Big surprise there. Then Constantine, who's just now starting to favor Christianity and get involved, he's just had his battle with the Milvian bridge, or he's about to, somewhere around this time, probably shortly after that. I'm not sure exactly when. He hears about this controversy in Alexandria, and he says, we need to settle this. And he writes a letter to both of them. And this is his letter. Constantine to Alexander. Victor, Constantinus, Maximus, Augustus to Alexander and Arius. He writes to both of them. How deep a wound did not my ears only, but my very heart receive in the report that divisions exist among yourselves, more grievous still than those which continued in that country, so that you, through whose aid I had hoped to procure a remedy for the errors of others, are in a state which needs healing even more than theirs. You're worse than the pagans. You guys fighting with each other. Essentially, this letter is saying, knock it off. It's not that important, whatever it is you're arguing about. Typical emperor response, right? He's like, I don't want to have the whole thing explained to me. I don't really care. Figure it out. That's essentially what he's going to say here. Let's read a little more. And yet, having made a careful inquiry into the origin and foundation of these differences, I find the cause to be of truly insignificant character and quite unworthy of such fierce contention. I understand then that the origin of the present controversy is this. When you, Alexander, demanded of the presbyters what opinion they severally maintained respecting a certain passage in the divine law, or rather, I should say that you asked them something connected with an unprofitable question, then you, Arius, inconsiderately insisted on what ought never to have been conceived at all, or if conceived, should have been buried in profound silence. Hence, it was that a dissension arose between you, fellowship was withdrawn, and the holy people rent into diverse parties, no longer preserve the unity of the one body. Now, therefore, do you both exhibit an equal degree of forbearance and receive the advice which your fellow servant righteously gives. He's calling himself your fellow servant. What then is this advice? It was wrong in the first instance to propose such questions as these, Alexander, or to reply to them when propounded, Arius. For those points of discussion which are enjoined by the authority of no law, but rather suggested by the contentious spirit which is fostered by misused leisure, even though they may be intended merely as an intellectual exercise, ought certainly to be confined to the region of our own thoughts, and not hastily produced in the popular assemblies, nor unadvisedly entrusted to the general ear. For how very few are there able either accurately to comprehend or adequately to explain subjects so sublime and abstruse in their nature. This is hysterical. I love this letter. Let therefore both the unguarded question and the inconsiderate answer receive your mutual forgiveness. He's telling them to forgive each other. You see that? For the cause of your difference has not been any of the leading doctrines. Look, it's not a big doctrine. It's not a cardinal belief or precepts of the divine law, nor has any new heresy respecting the worship of God arisen among you. You are in truth of one and the same judgment. You may therefore well join in communion and fellowship. It reminds me of a parent that has two kids fighting, and the parent comes, and it's the dad, and he slaps both of them on the hand and says, forgive each other, give it back, give me that thing. Stop talking about that. Forgive each, now let's move on. Sort of like what this letter's doing. Totally doesn't work. It's a great idea. I wish it worked. Honestly, and in the whole controversy, this is probably like the wisest thing that you can see as far as a response. It's like, guys, this is an abstruse thing, whether he's eternal, whether he's begotten, has a beginning. Like, this is not salvational. Let's not divide over this. And besides, it's so complicated, nobody even understands what you're talking about. Before this happened, you'd have people sitting next to each other in church. Some believed he's eternal. Some believed he had a beginning. Some maybe were really smart like Origen and found a way to believe both at the same time, which sounds like a contradiction to me, but whatever. Like, you had people with different views in the same churches. It wasn't a heresy. We could all worship together. After this will be the definitive belief as we build towards the doctrine of the Trinity over time here. So he goes on, he calls the situation small and insignificant, trifling and foolish verbal differences. That's Constantine's summary of it. And I think if both sides just listen to Constantine, I mean, I half love Constantine and I half hate him. You know, like half of the things, you know, there's so much good and so much bad that he did. But I think this is one of the good things he tried to do, is just like, guys, let's settle down. Because, again, I know the rest of the story afterwards, and there was just so much pain and suffering that's been caused by not letting this thing alone or making it into such a big deal. All right, then we have a couple more councils. We have the Council in Alexandria of 324, which is called by a man named Hosius of Cordoba, Spain. Hosius is Constantine's closest, most trusted Christian advisor. He's way out there from Spain. By the way, Constantine was a ruler in the western part of the empire before he conquered everyone else and took over the whole thing and became the sole emperor of the entire empire. So he's pulling a lot from the west, but this is an eastern controversy in Alexandria. And the east kind of has a reputation for being a little nerdy, and the west is more practical. And so he's bringing in this advisor, and he's like, all right, Hosius, go down there, bring this letter, read it to them, fix this. Hosius goes down, has a council. He sides with Alexander. He agrees with Alexander. He thinks Alexander's right. And he kicks out Arius again. Doesn't really fix it. Then there's another council in 324, or no, actually that's 325. It's a typo. 325 in Antioch, also called by Hosius of Cordoba, in which he is now in a different city. He's in Antioch, and he condemns Arius again. And at this council, he excommunicates Eusebius of Caesarea. Eusebius is a very famous guy to us. I don't think he was so famous to them yet because he wrote the church history. But he had already done that, and he had already established himself as like a superstar Origenist scholar. His teacher was Pamphilus, and Pamphilus' teacher was Origen. So like Eusebius is the steward of Origen's library. He literally owns all of Origen's books in Caesarea, and he's a steward of them. And this guy's going to kick this Eusebius out of the church. And then in 325, we have another council in Nicaea, which we'll cover next time. This is the big one. It deserves a lot more attention than I can give you in the time I have left. So just in the few minutes I have left, I want to talk about Arius' theology so that you understand it pretty clearly. Arius was from Libya. Sabellius was from Libya. Sabellius taught what they call a heresy, that the Father and the Son are the same, that there's no distinction between them. It's just a difference in mode or aspect, but not a difference in being or person or anything like that. Arius is sensitive to Sabellianism because he's from that same area. So when Alexander starts talking in a way that sounds like Sabellius, Arius the Libyan, hears Sibelius the Libyan and says, no, not in my church. This is not how we roll. This is not the doctrine. This is not what we learned. So Arius may not have thought much about this subject until Alexander started asking these questions and preaching this one particular idea. But once Arius did start thinking about it, he's a logician. If you have a beginning, if you are begotten, you have a beginning. If you have a beginning, you didn't exist before your beginning. Like, it's perfect logic. You can't even argue with it. And so Arius is trying to preserve tradition, but he's also trying to communicate what he's saying, and he does innovate a little bit in that he says that the Son was begotten ex nihilo, from nothing. And this phrase, the idea that the Son is begotten or created from nothing, is used a lot by his enemies to sort of like be an outlandish statement that nobody would ever believe. Jesus is obviously, or not Jesus, the Son is obviously begotten from the Father, not from nothing, right? So Arius gets himself in a little bit of trouble there, but he does turn church before the outbreak of the Arian controversy, who does not, in some sense, regard the Son as subordinate to the Father. Literally everybody. In fact, I was reading one of Alexander's letters. He's a subordinationist. This guy is supposed to be like the Trinitarian guy. There's no Trinity yet. Like he's working on something that is going to be indispensable to the Trinity, but we're not there yet. That's another few decades off. He still thinks that because the Father is unbegun, that the Father is superior to the Son. He says it in his letter, not in an original sense. So it's not as clear and cut and dry as you might think. Arius wrote a poem called the Thalia. We don't know for sure that Arius called it the Thalia or his critics called it the Thalia, but the word Thalia means activity, God, and wise in every way. In the steps of these I have come. I, going along with them, I, the well-known, who have suffered much for the glory of God. I want to point out here, what is he trying to say? He's trying to say that he's not inventing this. He learned this from other people. What kind of people? People that are wise and smart, people that have been taught by God, holy Orthodox people. He's thinking of himself as a steward of a deposit of faith, of a rule of faith, taught by Orthodox people who came before him. He continues, who have learnt wisdom from God, and I know knowledge. God then himself is in essence ineffable to all. He alone has neither equal nor like, none comparable in glory. We call him unbegotten. That's one of the big buzzwords here. Because of the one who in nature begotten. The one in nature begotten. We raise hymns to him as unbegun because of him who has a beginning. We adore him as eternal because of the one born in time. You see how he's drawing the contrast between God and the Son, or between the Father and the Son? The unbegun appointed the Son to be beginning of things begotten, and bore him as his own Son, in this case, giving birth. He has nothing proper to God in his essential property, for neither is he equal nor yet consubstantial with him. This consubstantial word we're going to look at next time, but that's the big buzzword on the other side, on Alexander's side of the fence. So his slogans were, he was made from what was not. That's one of Arius' slogans. He was not before he was born, and there was when he was not, which I think is the most rhythmic of all of them in English, at least. You know, these things in Greek, I'm sure, sound awesome, but, you know, we're kind of missing out some of it in English here. Two books that you want to get that I want to recommend to you if you're interested in this controversy. There is not a better book on planet Earth than The Search for the Christian Doctrine of God by RPC Hansen. It is the most thorough, epic treatment. It covers the whole controversy from 318 to 381. It's massive, it's hard, it's written in technical, I mean, it's English, but like, you know, he's a super scholarly guy, and he is in touch with the sources, not just the primary sources in English, but in their original languages, and often even translates himself. massive tome. He covers everything, and he's very honest, which I love. I really appreciate that. If you are not feeling up to reading such a long book, you can read a shorter one by Richard Rubinstein. Richard Rubinstein based his book on RPC Hansen's book and some other sources, but his is called When Jesus Became God, the epic fight over Christ's divinity in the last days of Rome. So if you're interested in the Trinitarian controversy, what happened with Arius and Alexander, and then the aftermath, which we're going to get to next time, I would recommend these two books. Let's review. Bishop Alexander of Alexandria began teaching that the Son of God was eternal, although he didn't teach that he was equal with God. It's interesting. Presbyter Arius objected, teaching instead that because the Son of God was begotten, there was a time when he was not. After multiple debates, Alexander held a council and insisted Arius sign his confession of faith, sign his confession or face excommunication. Arius refused. When Alexander ejected Arius from the churches in Alexandria, 89 others left with him, including clergy. Eusebius of Nicomedia and Eusebius of Caesarea tried to convince Alexander to reinstate Arius. And Constantine. Alexander wrote letters to bishops around the world, warning them not to accept Arius or those who believed like him. Although both Alexander and Arius were subordinationists, Alexander believed God was only greater than his Son and that he was unbegun, though both were eternal. I still, even though I wrote that sentence, I still don't quite know how you make sense of that. But in his letter, he will say he is only greater in the sense that he's unbegun. And it's like, well, if he's unbegun, if the Son is eternal, doesn't that mean he's unbegun as well? But no, it means he's begotten eternally. Arius believed God's begetting of the Son was a creative act, though the Son was still supreme over other creatures. Arius did not invent the idea that the Son had a beginning, but his insistence that the Son was made from nothing instead of from God was new. Alexander's heavy-handed tactics polarized churches on this issue, resulting in Emperor Constantine's involvement. Next week, we'll look at what happens next when the emperor says, all right, let's have the first global conference of bishops. Let's invite everybody, all the leaders. We'll get them all together at my summer palace in Nicaea. We'll pay for it. We'll fund it by the government of the empire. We'll use the horses that we use to move mail around. We'll move bishops around. We'll get them all there. It'll be 1,000 people all in, a couple hundred bishops, and then all their attendants and other folks that are needful to have this event happen. And we will fix this issue. We will come to a decision, and we will stand by that decision for all time. It was a wonderful dream. But we'll have to wait until next time to see what happens as we continue in our journey through early church history.